Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Hudson Institute. My name is Riley Walters. Thank you for joining us for our event today on U.S. Japan in a world of information uncertainty. So the world is constantly filled with information uncertainty or imperfect information. I think most people think of these things as disinformation being spread through social media. Other people might think of information uncertainty as it relates to elections, but it's much more than that. It's pretty encompassing. It can deal with our day-to-day lives. It can deal with our interactions that we have with each other, with our governments, between governments, and so on. And so both the U.S. and Japan, I think, have traditionally taken different approaches to dealing with information uncertainty. And as we have new administrations across the Pacific, I see there's a continuance of maybe divergence even in our different approaches to managing information uncertainty. In Japan, the Japanese government has been approaching information uncertainty with a general approach of having three pillars. One is institutionalizing measures that they're adopting and so that they can cooperate better with international partners. The second is working with international organizations to create these standards that can work internationally. And finally is increasing the literacy and awareness around what information uncertainty means. I think, again, as I mentioned already, we hear buzzwords like disinformation or misinformation, or even words like fake news. These all relate to, ultimately, information uncertainty. And so to approach this measure, the Japanese government has been adopting new legislation that increases transparency with social media providers, internet service providers, and others. They've been working with private companies to build public partnerships in managing this emerging problem for them, and other measures. Meanwhile, the U.S. government may be taking a different approach. It definitely appears that the Trump administration wants to take a step back from regulating speech online, certain types of speech online. And so we're going to talk about all these matters today. We're going to talk about the U.S.-Japan approaches to information uncertainty, how the two governments might be looking at these things differently or even collaboratively. How might the U.S. and Japan actually work together to combat misinformation, information uncertainty online? Because a lot of this sometimes actually comes from bad actors, nation states even, who are trying to undermine our civil societies. And so we've got a great lineup here today of experts who can talk about U.S.-Japan approaches to information uncertainty. Let me just give their quick bios, and then I'm gonna let them speak for a few minutes, and then we're gonna go into a quick back and forth before we end this. And so first we have Daniel Byman. He is a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and he's also director of the Security Studies program at Georgetown University. After him is Tatsuya Kurosaka, who is a project associate professor at Keio University and visiting scholar at Georgetown University. And finally, we have John Fuse, who is founder and CEO of Verifix Incorporated. And so with that, Dan, I'm going to pass it on to you. Love to hear your remarks on this, your thoughts. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Riley. And it's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. So I'm going to talk about the U.S. approach. And as Riley indicated, it is certainly going in very different directions. I think it's helpful, and I'm not going to make this a history lesson, but I think it's helpful to go back to the first Trump administration and proceed from there. There was awareness after the 2016 election in both the social media company side and also in the broader public that foreign powers, notably Russia, tried to use social media to interfere in U.S. elections. And there are scholarly debates about the actual impact of that, but the attempt was nevertheless quite real and very well documented. In addition, we saw a range of bad actors using different platforms. These included, known terrorist groups like the Islamic State, but it also included radical causes like Nazis or violent misogynists using this. And there was a spreading awareness during the first Trump years of the scope of these problems. And then added to all this, and this became especially acute during the COVID pandemic, was the problem of disinformation, that there were huge harms being done to U.S. public health by disinformation on COVID itself, on vaccines. And some of this was deliberately manipulated, and some of it was simply created by local American actors. What made dealing with all these problems more complex, though, was this became a very political issue. A fairly standard talking point among Republicans was that the social media companies were highly biased against them. And the premise was, look, these are San Francisco-based companies. They're all a bunch of liberals, and they're very critical of what we stand for. Again, scholars who studied this came up with a very different answer, showing that the major accounts, most influential accounts, were actually run by Republicans and often very conservative Republicans, and that we have a lot of leaked information from social media companies showing that their policies actually tended to favor more conservative voices in terms of making exceptions to the rules. The problem, though, was a lot of disinformation was linked to positions that were endorsed by President Trump. And this included questions on the efficacy of many COVID restrictions. This especially, though, included election results. And President Trump took claims that Russia interfered with the election to mean that his own election was illegitimate. And although many people, in my view, you can make one claim that there was interference without making the other claim, he saw the two as equated. And so this became something that was constantly criticized, was that when companies took this down as disinformation or people labeled it as disinformation, it became very political. President Biden tried to push on these issues when he came in many ways, but the companies very much had their antennas up politically and were very sensitive to this. This was challenged in the U.S. courts. There's a U.S. legal term called jawboning, which basically tries to prevent government from pushing its preferences on private companies and others, because there's an implicit hint of coercion that if you don't do this, we might withhold contracts or introduce regulations. That wasn't, to my knowledge, the Biden administration's goal, but this was challenged as well. And so the companies became very cautious about close cooperation with the administration and even sharing a lot of information. Areas where there seemed to be bipartisan support included a ban on TikTok. And this was a major challenge to the United States, in that it was the first major social media platform that was not run by Americans. And so there were questions about, would China influence this in a way for national security that would hinder the United States? There were also a lot of concerns about AI safety, and that just as both companies and governments had missed the dangers coming from social media, and some of those dangers are disinformation and national security, but some are also kind of mental health issues, that all that was missed early on, that this time around with AI, those concerns would be in the forefront. So those were raised. In contrast to TikTok, where Congress passed a ban, on AI safety, nothing was really done. So there was a lot of talk about it, but in practice, the government effectively did nothing. As Riley's intro indicated, we're seeing dramatic change even from this very limited effort in the new administration. There's been criticism by this administration of anything associated with DEI, with anything associated with claims of Russian interference. And many companies have decided simply to get rid of or pare down dramatically their content moderation teams. And they're not even trying to do this. They're arguing in the name of free speech that it's better to just have people say things, even if there's a lot of disinformation. And as a result, disinformation on these platforms has grown considerably. And there's much less detection of foreign malign influence. They've also pared back government efforts to identify foreign malign influence. So at the State Department, at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and other areas have been cut back. Making this worse, at times you have conspiracy theorists in charge of major U.S. government agencies. So there are a number of cabinet level officials who have endorsed what used to be considered conspiracy theories. And these are things that in the past would have been taken down and are now being promulgated by U.S. officials. There seems to be no concerns on AI safety. In fact, the opposite, kind of a rush to make sure that there's a smooth path for rapid growth. Of course, there's been a very dramatic flip on TikTok, where the government has decided not to enforce the law, frankly, about the ban on TikTok. All this seems to be in the name of openness, but it is fairly openly by the Trump administration highly politicized, where they want these platforms to be pro-Trump and they want content to be pro-Trump, and they're very willing to criticize anything that they feel supports Democratic positions, often by saying they're woke or other kind of different terms they're using, but at the same time promoting Republican positions. So it's very much not neutrality that they're seeking, but partisanship. Making this worse, not only is that government's efforts to monitor are being cut or downsized, is that companies themselves are very afraid to share information with the U.S. government. Elon Musk, because he has access to so much data, is a competitor in the information space. And so companies are reluctant to share their data with the government because they feel that in some ways they're sharing data with a competitor company. And as a result, they'd be at a business disadvantage. You have a few illegal things left, right? There's still broad agreement that child sexual abuse material should be stopped, antitrust, a few others that are kind of bedrocks of the system. But in terms of going after hate speech, going after incendiary content, going after disinformation, that's gone from, I would say, very low, fairly ineffective levels to almost non-existent. So let me stop there, and I look forward to additional remarks by others on the panel.
Great. And that was wonderful. Thank you very much. Next is Tatsuya Kurosaka-san.
All right. Yeah, thank you very much for the great opportunity to have a brief introductions about Japanese activities. We are facing the information uncertainty, and particularly the so-called disinformations. So this time, Japan has 3 tracks to make sure the resolutions of tackling the particular information. First of all, we are about to be aware of the problems of disinformation itself. It means that we are identifying the disinformation and related affairs like election campaigns and information on natural disasters. Because in Japan, there's many severe disasters, not only a big earthquake, the tsunami, but also the heavy rain coming from the seasonal typhoon every year. So many problems happen in the context of the disinformation, and all problems are coming from the cyberspace, especially like social medias. But unfortunately, the social media has already probably a 10 years experience from the bad communications, like coming from the Crimea invasion in 2013, 2014. So that's why now we are facing this kind of problems, and the reason why there's a unique incident in particular at the kind of the social medias. But today in Japan, there are also unique incident at the news aggregation service like Yahoo News or something like that, because many Japanese people are familiar with the traditional newspapers and broadcasting companies, but that their channels of distribution is going to move that kind of service like a news aggregators services. So we are collaborating to recognize the nature of the uncertain informations. This activity has been gathered not only from the governmental side, but the private sector and academia as well. For example, originator profile, which I introduced before, is trying to provide a function to the consumer and audience in order to enable verifications of the publisher itself and its authenticity by using the digital signing technologies and the trusted server architecture as well. This is now where we're trying to deploy this kind of the services solutions for the ordinary people to enable the verifications to the publishers and information certain information as well. Second, we are planning to fix the problems with the ecosystem of disinformations. This problem would be isolated between the digital advertisement market and the possible efforts coming from the big tech as the communication platforms. Nowadays, the digital advertisement seems to be one of the core of economy, which delivers not only healthy communication, but possible crimes like fraud, spoofing, and scam as well. So we need to improve that trust of that transactions. For example, managing the real-time biddings for the advertisement, developing a private marketplace, gathering from the trusted advertisers, and their verification by using the originator profile OP and related technology as well. And finally, we are introducing the active cyber defense, so-called ACD. It is an aggressive approach rather than I mentioned before in order to fight against disinformation coming from other parties, which are not belonging to like-minded countries like Western countries. But this approach is needed to be arranged with our constitutions, including the freedom of speech, secret of communications, and also the exclusive defenses. So now this time we are preparing the legislation to enable ACD, active cyber defense, this time not only for the protection by ourselves, but for contribution to the Western countries like the United States and related countries as well. So as a conclusion, the disinformation and uncertain information is very complex problems. And every problem is coming from not only cyber space, but also the physical space as well. Because as I mentioned, in Japan, especially in Japan, there's many people now already understand that the information is issued from the newspaper companies and the broadcasting company and web companies, the web media as well. And also the social media are one of the big information source, especially in the case of the disaster conditions. But that's why we are needing to find the certain information, and also that we need to verify the information and publish itself. So we would like to move in on this kind of activity this times. Okay, thank you.
Great. No, wonderful. Thank you very much. All right, John, you have a last matter up.
let me try and wrap up the last two meetings we had, as well as today's conversation. What's clear to me, being in this space both as an offensive and defensive tool, is that there is a big gap between what's covert and what is public, right? And we saw that even at the last meeting, that the Zinc Networks disclosure, the U.S. state, USAID covertly hiring influencers into certain countries. We see there was another article today about China doing the same thing, and somehow we're upset about China, but we're not going to talk about what the U.S. is doing. Voice of America versus an RT, right? There's many things, most of the things that Russia and China do to us and our allies are things that we do abroad. Budget is 90% offensive, 10% defensive. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's totally appropriate. And it is what it is. But what it does do is it hampers the coordination between nations. So, but the coordination between Japan and the US gets hampered when we're not being honest about what we're necessarily doing to each other on some level. So I'm not sure that that is a problem that we'll ever totally solve, because I'm not sure it's a problem necessarily that should be solved. So the way I look at coordination between countries is on the following, and that is to redefine from information uncertainty to information uncertainty that essentially does harm. We can both believe in Santa Claus, and we know that Santa Claus is fake, but Santa Claus isn't really doing any harm to people. And that is then from a question from a government standpoint, whether it's US or Japan, is how do we measure population cognitive stability? Essentially, the cognitive stability, the mental health of the population. We can measure the economic, right, the economic aspect of countries, but how do we measure their mental health, their cognitive stability, right? And that is really a repeat and remeasure situation. It's a test, retest, correlation type situation, and something that I think needs to be defined and can be defined and be the basis for cooperation between countries in terms of when do they feel the cognitive stability of their country is in danger, and then getting to the root of what's causing that. I do think then that there's another issue of who should be measuring that cognitive stability. And so I'm going to take, since President Trump released the JFK files last night, I'm going to take a quote from one of the JFK files. And that's Arthur Schlesinger's memo and his criticism of the CIA. And his quote is this: if intelligence is too closely connected with operation, then those committed to a particular operation will tend to select out the intelligence which validates the operation. I call it the self-licking ice cream cone, right? If you're so committed to a position, you will find the metrics to justify that position, whether it's right or wrong. And especially when we're talking about information, and we're talking about censorship, and we're talking about trust, I think there's a real issue of who should be measuring the cognitive stability of a country. And that really should be divorced from both the politicians who are injecting their own kind of domestic communications, as well as from finding disinformation, right, or sending disinformation out. If you are trying to influence another country to do a certain activity, should the group who's influencing it be the same group who's measuring effectiveness? And the answer to that is probably no. And that is probably that the basis for cooperation between countries should be divorced from defensive and offensive action to defining cognitive stability of a population, measuring it, monitoring it, and knowing that your population is cognitively safe based on all the internet that they're hitting, all the social media, all the different innocent or intentional attacks, that they are safe. Because if they're safe, nothing really matters, right? It doesn't make a difference if China is attacking you, if they're sending out 600 influencers to try and make it seem like there's a problem. You're fine. And I think that's, in my mind, that's where there's the opportunity to share focus. I know there have been some groups who have tried to start those metrics. They haven't gotten that far. They often hit early criticism, but I think that's where there's massive work that could be done, that if that is defined, will help frame this entire issue to know what needs to be attended to. And I will stop there.
Thank you very much. That idea that you hit on there at the end, it sounds very complicated. It's probably why not too many people have been able to do it, right? I mean, how do you even begin to measure the cognitive health of a society? Is it trust between people? Is it trust between people and their government? Is it just people knowing that they'll be safe tomorrow versus safe from a year from now?
We do it now through a variety of metrics that often parallel what happens in the commercial world. Right. So I think SOCOM has publicly talked about this. Their offer for an influence ops, they'll do a beginning survey and an end survey. And they'll try and use the surveys to figure out if what they did worked. They might use social listening along the way. And they might also try and see what's happening with social listening. I don't want to plug our tool. We use belief monitoring. We belief map a population and we check their belief as it relates to trust in government and key metrics. Right? And those metrics of what's important to a country can be measured. If you don't measure it, you don't know whether or not you need to be worried. So as Dan, raised originally with the Trump Russia issue, election issue, it's two different issues. Was there an attempt by Russia, and did it have an impact? It's important to know the difference, right? As Dan pointed out, I mean, that's an important distinction, because just because there was Russian interference, if it had no impact, who cares? We see that in Romania. We see a country lose, throw out an election. Pretty dramatic stuff, because they saw some disinformation. I can spend $1,000 and dump disinformation into a country in a heartbeat. If that's enough to kill an election, that's pretty powerful. Right now, I can start to create chaos by just dumping in ineffectual but obvious disinformation.
Interesting. Kurosaka-san, for the Japanese perspective, I mean, do you think that, like John's been talking about, measuring cognitive health? I mean, how would the Japanese think about what cognitive health means for their society, and how that might be different from either like a U.S. or international? Because my understanding, my experience is that Japan often wants to adopt what's internationally accepted, and so on the one hand, yes, I think a lot of us would want greater U.S. Japan coordination, but I know there's people in Tokyo who would prefer the international approach.
It's very hard. It's very difficult questions. And first of all, John introduced the words of the other strangers. It was so impressive that I think that it mentions everything is depending on the context of society these times. And so in Japan, many of Japanese people already trust the authenticities of the government, including the local government, and also the trusting to the massive communication providers like newspaper companies and broadcasting companies. So this time in Japan, many people when they need the certain information that many people switching on the TVs to take the latest news that's coming from the broadcasting companies on the TV. But it's depending on the generations. So some of the young generations already reject this kind of the mass communications, and they are depending on the social media these times. And the young generation and also moving forward to the active communications through the social medias. So it means that they are not only the audience, but also the publisher as well. So that's why Japan, today's community of Japan is now mixing up and mess up this time, those communications. It's very hard to cover all generations, all the ordinary communities, but that's why we would like to give the ordinary people a chance to verify the communication itself. Everybody doesn't have enough approach to verify the communication, not only newspapers, but broadcasting, but also the social media as well. So I think this is the first step to recognize the information the certain informations or the uncertain informations. And also, there are many possible problems coming from the other countries, like not like-minded country this time, because they are already using the specific Japanese words thanks to the GenAI this time. So that's why and we now every time recognize the problems of the coming kind of the problems of the communications and the information as well.
Interesting. Dan, let me ask you, you were talking about this administration's political appointees, and as we sort of talked about already, they definitely have a different perspective, you could call it, on just information in general. And so, what do you see going forward? Because I think on the one hand, yes, they come from a very unique background with very unique perspectives, but they're now thrown into a world. Despite all that's going on the deregulatory side with Doge, I mean, there's still a government in place. There's still some level of checks and balances. They still have to work within a government. How do you foresee is there going to be a dramatic evolution of how U.S. Approaches disinformation, or do you think the ship's already sort of left the dock? It's just going to be left alone. Companies are going to continue to operate individually over the next 4 years, or other measures.
So your language is careful, but in my view, kind of euphemisms don't work well, right? So unique and different are misleading, right? There are people who embrace conspiracy theories in senior parts of the U.S. government, right? There are people who have called for weaponizing U.S. laws against companies that don't do what they want, right? I mean, we should be united in calling these out, right? These are outrageous. And the checks and balances are actually not there, right? The U.S. Congress, there was a debate about how many, Trump appointees might be rejected because in a number of cases they had significant ties to hostile foreign governments. In other cases, they believed widely discredited information and promulgated them, and people were approved. You've had members of Congress who say, I do disagree strongly with this policy, but I will support it because the president supports it. Right. So we've in recent decades had relatively weak congressional opposition to presidents of the same party, but that has become even more so currently. And there's a debate about how much the courts will check things, right, and how much the administration will listen to the courts. I think that question is still out. I don't think we can decide one way or another. So from the point of view of administration officials, this is working. Right? This is very successful. I want to stress this. It's something, as I'm sure you can tell both from my words and my tone, that I disagree with. But it's something that has been working. I can't deny the efficacy of it. Right now, it is intended to be very laissez-faire on the regulatory side. And by being laissez-faire on the government content involvement side, the belief is that it'll favor the Trump agenda. To the extent it doesn't favor the Trump agenda, there may be action. Like I could easily see threats against social media companies if there's a lot of content there that is effective in its criticism of the president in different ways. But having said all that, there's a huge amount of uncertainty in all this, right? And that this is an administration that has not only rapidly changed from the Biden administration, it's actually rapidly changed from what it did in its own first administration. And it's quite possible that there can be dramatic changes in a few months from the current dramatic changes. There's a chaos factor that's going on here. To add one more bit of uncertainty, it's very unclear who is actually responsible for which policies. And there's always a question in any administration about who matters on which particular issue. Right? But it is questionable to me how much figures like the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State are setting policy on issues such as Russia, or certainly on issues such as the harassment of Canada or the harassment of Denmark, right? Longstanding NATO allies and very close friends of the United States that are now being, highly criticized. And that uncertainty will show up very much in this question of tech companies, because you have a lot of actors in the Trump administration who are very personally involved in this space and have strong equities. And to be clear, I don't know. I would love to kind of give you the player's card of who's involved on setting this agenda. And I have some guesses, but the real answer is I don't know. And I think that's true for many issues where there are a lot of people who have indirect ties to the president outside organizational lines who will matter tremendously.
So you mentioned Canada, strong ally. Japan is also an important, strong ally for the United States. As we were talking about, they're looking at their own policies, setting up regulations and legal authorities to manage online companies and other ways to manage information uncertainty. How, it's one way, it's one perspective for them to also look at the U.S. and just say, what's going on? I have no idea. The world is burning. But I think they still have to make a response at some level, either do something or do nothing, right? And so what should sort of the international perspective be of what the U.S. is doing, and how should other countries either think to work with the U.S. on dealing with these problems around information certainty, or just go it alone, maybe work more internationally with the EU and others and setting some sort of standard or approach or future metrics for measuring, cognitive health or what else?
I just jump in on that. So was it 4 years ago when NATO was trying to decide whether they get into cognitive warfare, right? And so it was raised at the Spain meeting. And it was a fairly large issue in terms of what role does NATO have in cognitive warfare. It's needed. If you're going to have kinetic warfare, you also have to have cognitive warfare. If NATO's only defensive on kinetic, should it only be defensive on cognitive? And then how do we coordinate on that? And that ended up being somewhat of a disaster. I think at first there was a push to create, they called it the Manhattan Project for Cognitive. They were out to collect all the companies, the technologies, and we're all going to be put in a little an isolated area and move this forward, just like the development of the atomic bomb. That was stopped because it's the realization that control of cognitive is, if you can control a country with words and with an inject on social media and with PR and control what people do with words, that is more powerful than blowing them up. Threatening to blow someone up is simply a crude form of influence. If Russia doesn't do what we want them to do, we will blow them up. Being able to change Russia with words is much more powerful. If you can do it reliably, right, predictably, repeatedly, much, much more powerful. And like I said, the countries that control that right now, it's no different than the countries with atomic bombs. Those don't get shared with everyone. Those don't get disseminated around the world. There'll be those that have them and those that don't. And it's the same process.
And so, Dan, going back to my question, how should Japan look at what's going on in the U.S.? How would you advise the government of Japan say, hey, there's 4 years. That's.
So this is a very difficult question because, of course, the cultural and political traditions are so different, right? In the United States, the government telling people what is truth just goes against U.S. historical traditions, right? And so that's, it was difficult enough in the United States on something like health, where, for the most part, there are experts who are recognized and have general views, and they're, of course, like every other human being, fallible. But you could say that, someone who's infectious disease specialist knows more about COVID than I do, right? And but even then, it was very difficult to get Americans to listen to expertise of governments. But when you start to get to more politically contentious issues, then it becomes much harder. And there's a question at a certain point, perhaps justly so. And Japan, of course, has very different traditions in terms of government leadership of its people, in terms of trust in bureaucratic institutions, in terms of how people respond in the education system. So as I am very concerned about the one thing that I want to emphasize, what John raised, right, is we're often simply not gathering enough information to be able to evaluate properly, right? So we have snippets of information that have come from the outside, but you have very few reporting requirements. And as a result, it's actually very hard to know both the numerators and denominators here, right? The scope of disinformation as opposed to, and what percentage is it of overall consumption? How much is used by particular communities? A huge amount of research was done in this area, but on Twitter, which is one very narrow platform, and after the change in ownership, that's almost impossible by researchers. So a very narrow time period as well. When platforms are far more consequential, like YouTube, have escaped scrutiny on this. So I would say a lot of it to me is really about trying to have very good reporting requirements to enable an understanding of the scope of the problem. Because if, as John pointed out, there's disinformation, but people are not listening. Right. Okay, that doesn't seem like a crisis to me, and I don't want to expend a lot of resources on it. But if it is fundamentally shaping discourse, then that has very negative consequences. So that is one area. I would like to see government more involved in partnering with companies. That has become harder and harder, and I think that's a shame. There certainly historically have been very positive collaborations between the U.S. government and private companies, and I think there could be in this space. And one thing I would advise the Japanese government is try to get ahead on AI issues. It is a whole new world in the cognitive space and in terms of different means of dissemination. And I think that's going to, if governments could get ahead of that, that would do a lot of good.
Right. John, we were just talking a lot about information collecting. One of the things that you and I have talked about in the past is, the fact that when it comes to the battle against information uncertainty, the challenge is you just need constant updating of your information. How do you manage that? How do you manage keeping up with just the need for just constant new information? I mean, information is always imperfect, and it always requires updating. How do you manage that?
Correct, and that's been the U.S. problem. So it was 2018 when we walked into the State Department. The issue at that point in time, the State Department could find disinformation 48 hours after it occurred. So we originally walked in, the U.S., it shouldn't be a supply, right? Has kind of root access to the internet. There are places that hoover every single little piece of information floating across the internet to process it and look through it, right? Look through all the posts. The government has fire hose access to Twitter, right? So the government's not constrained like the researchers on some level. The government sees everything on every single platform. They have a fire hose. The problem is too much information. It's not too little information, it's too much information. So the problem in 2018 was, how do we reduce the amount of information that these tools need to digest and look at to get to that answer quicker and reduce that 48-hour threat window to real time and ideally go in front of it. That was the major issue. So it's not a question of information in general, it's the right information. Russia and China are not hoovering everything off the internet to run their programs against you. You would see that. Russia and China aren't running massive surveys around constantly. You would see that, right? You're not seeing those footprints from these offensive systems that are beating us in many cases. It's the Russian system uses specially collected weekly surveys. They call them special polls. That's what we do. I don't want to plug my company again, but that's what we provide to governments. We provide those nudges, those indicators that if you amplify, change behavior, they change cognitive states of populations. You need to know those, right? I think there needs to be more research in that. There has been a lot. DARPA had the Paper WASP program. They had, I forget the name of the second program. Hopkins APL had a $3 million grant for narrative selection. When you look at the US disinformation systems, where they get hung up is the narrative selection, trying to find the narrative, the word, the trigger that's actually doing harm. Because once you have that, you can then feed it into all the tools, trace it around the internet, look for where it originated, and that's where your defensive capabilities come online. So it's U.S. has known what it is, right? And there's been a number of efforts to find it and automate it. We're one. I'm sure there are other solutions out there, but it's that narrative selection. Know the narrative that hinders, say, trust in government matters. It's before an election, and you want to tank a government or tank a party. What inject? What social media inject? What media inject do you use to change it? Because those go under the radar. They're not what trends. What trends is easy to find, right? It's the stuff that no one is seeing that is actually doing most of the harm. And unfortunately, we have to do that in real time. We can't go back historically and try and retroactively piece together what a population does. So I tell people, if we don't catch something in real time and we're not dealing with it in real time, you kind of have to put your hands up and just accept it happened to you, right? So it's no different than going back to the elections, the 16, whatever. There's no point to go back and fight them. What happened, happened. It's our new reality, kind of, and let's move forward off of that point.
Is there a general timeline for real time? Is that 48 hours or is that 2 weeks?
We do, depending on the country, we do every other week with data processed and back in that country's hands within a few hours so that it can be dealt with immediately. In some places, if it's a rapidly moving information, we will collect data weekly. In some situations, if it is an active situation where there are threats, coups, et cetera, we're collecting data every 2 to 3 days and looking at those 3-day windows to see what has happened, how has the population reacted, what are they reacting to next, what's the irritant that might get dropped into a social media feed, that might get dropped into news, that will further aggravate or hopefully relieve the pressure and stabilize the population.
Interesting. Kurosaka-san, let me go back to something you mentioned earlier. You mentioned Japan is currently working on legislation to introduce active cyber defense, which is a more offensive approach to cybersecurity. Within the context of this, within the context of information uncertainty, is there a role that active cyber defense has to play? Is it mostly just on the information sharing side, or is there a different component that the Japanese government is thinking about when it comes to active cyber defense and information uncertainty?
Yes, I think the active cyber defense ACD would be possible good weapons to tackle against uncertain informations this time, because we don't have it. So that's why we need to prepare for the kind of the weapons to fight against the situations. But I think it's not enough, because the ACD activities of the ACD itself is only the legislations and also the generic activities to understand this kind of the situations. This time, Dan and John had great advices to Japanese policymaker this time, so tackling particular informations. So we need to have more understanding the mechanism of the individual organization itself, like System 1, System 2, as Kahneman mentions before. And also we need to understand the possible incidents like cognitive warfare, especially as this kind of the disinformations coming from the other parties as the countries which would like to make confusions of the Japanese societies in the ordinary life, especially for the elections and also the ordinary communication in the disaster situations. So, and this is a very, very important point to understand ourselves, to have the cognition mechanisms in our brain itself. And also, I mentioned that cyber-physical systems. That system is depending on the latest societies. Like I mentioned, this is a harmonization between the traditional communications and the cyber communication as well. And the next phase, we need to think about the cyber-physical system in the next era. It would be having possible problems to control the physical systems like infrastructures and also the basic transportation systems and the power systems as well. And also that we are living in the physical atmosphere. So that's why we need to find this kind of the resolution, not only depending only on the cyber system communications, but also the cyber and physical joint or ordinary life.
All right. Physical and cybersecurity, both very important.
Right.
So I'm just going to go down the line. Final thoughts from the three of you. Anything, hopefully something more positive. Dan, the floor is yours.
So I'm straining to find something more positive because I think it's a relatively bleak information environment out there. What I would say is there is tremendous potential for change if people and companies are interested in this. I think there would be support if there were efforts, whether it's trying to have more restrictions on companies like TikTok or to push social media companies much harder on fairly basic things. Again, simply giving up information as one of them. So I would say there is potential for improvement, but it does require some degree of political will. And I think, unfortunately, in that direction, we're going backward rather than forward.
Interesting. Kurosaka-san?
Yes, we need to carry on working about it because as Dan mentions, the TikTok is very interesting case that that applications combine our activities between the physical activities and the digital activities as well, and it would control our society. So that's why we now focusing about this kind of the practical applications and practical communications, but we also thinking about the possible problems coming from the new technologies like Gen AIs or something like that.
Yeah.
I'm gonna be positive.
Yes, John.
And that is, I do think Japan is uniquely situated to solve this problem, and something to think about, although we also think about this as a cost, as a harm of something being done to people. Selling a political candidate or sowing distrust in a country is no different than selling soap. It's no different than advertising. The country that figures out how to manage populations, how to ensure cognitive stability, how they're being advertised to, has the potential not only to develop and be the leader in kind of a defensive market, but there is a $1 trillion plus advertising market of learning how to advertise on distributed networks and learning how to introduce influence into social media that is yet to be truly tapped. And so I think that's the gold rush. And I think Japan is uniquely situated to actually solve that problem based on their structure. So I'm very hopeful. And hopefully this is the start of a discussion as Japan moves this issue forward over the next year or two.
Right.
And should be exciting.
Yeah, that's why we need to find resolutions, practical resolutions.
Yeah. Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. This has been a wonderful experience for me. I hope everyone else, you watching, learned and enjoyed this as well. Thank you to all of my speakers, the panelists. It's been wonderful hearing from you. Please stay tuned to hudson.org for other important events that are going on around town, around the world on all things from national security to foreign policy. Thank you again, and enjoy your day. Thank you, guys.